Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you may be joining us in the world today. My name is Cole Simcoe, here on behalf of Youth Power 2, or YP2LE as we refer to it. Super excited to welcome everybody to the webinar this morning, Designing Better Youth Center and Safe Spaces Programming, which is the launch event for our Youth Centers Toolkit. And with that, I would like to turn it over and introduce my colleague, Maria Brindelmeyer, who will give us a brief overview for anyone who's new to the YP2LE Learning Network. Maria?
Thank you, Cole. Yes, I'm Maria Brindelmeyer. I'm the Senior Knowledge Management Specialist on Youth Power 2 Learning and Evaluation. Welcome, everybody, to this webinar in our Learning Network webinar series. We're super excited about today's topic. We think it's one of the topics that are of so much interest both to youth serving organizations as well as youth themselves. So just a quick introduction to Youth Power 2 Learning and Evaluation, which is a USAID funded activity that is based on positive youth development. And so positive youth development, as we define it, is an approach that recognizes and supports youth rights to have assets such as skills or financial assets, to have the ability to leverage those assets through agency. And we also want to contribute to youth being able to kind of contribute to their own positive change, and to do all of this in an enabling environment. We are really very focused on that enabling environment, and I think some the activities that you'll hear today will also focus on that. So that's kind of just a quick introduction to positive youth development. Youth Power 2 Learning and Evaluation is focused on achieving sustainable systems change. We know that there are lots of programs out there, and our program is focused on translating lots of learnings and experiences that we gather through knowledge sharing, through stakeholder engagement, and through the application of learning to the more long-term sustainable system change. The program activities include the Learning Network as one of our components, and then we also have communities of practice. We hope that you will join some of those. They are on our website, youthpower.org. And I think at the end of this webinar, you'll hear a little bit more about that. So this just let me conclude that short introduction. And we will start with a brief video. One of the key features of successful positive youth development is safe spaces. They serve as a hub in marginalized communities for delivering other positive youth development features. And so we will have this short video, thanks to our colleagues from Creative, to highlight the impact of these models in communities. Cole, over to you.
Thanks, Maria. I'm just going to go ahead and start the video for us. Thanks.
En la región centroamericana, miles de jóvenes son impulsados cada día a involucrarse en ilícitos o pandillas. Pero desde hace 6 años, una puerta de oportunidades y esperanza ha sido abierta para los jóvenes de la región centroamericana. Estos son los centros de alcance por mi barrio, ubicados en el corazón de las comunidades más golpeadas por la violencia juvenil y la presencia de pandillas. Se convierten en una puerta de oportunidades para construir sus sueños y sus planes de vida de un modo diferente. Los centros de alcance por mi barrio, o CDAs, cuentan con 6 componentes. Uso creativo del tiempo libre. Todos los jóvenes que acuden a un CDA tienen la oportunidad de ocupar su tiempo libre en acciones positivas como divertirse tocando un instrumento, compartir con sus amigos en los juegos de mesa, jugar ping-pong, ejercitarse en un gimnasio o jugar PlayStation frente a una pantalla plana. Un segundo componente es la capacitación para el trabajo. Este ofrece la posibilidad a los jóvenes de aprender algún oficio, desarrollarse alguna habilidad o destreza para que puedan serles útiles al momento de trabajar. En un CDA, los jóvenes aprenden inglés y computación. Pueden aprender también serigrafía, panadería, manualidades, entre otras. Estas capacitaciones son otorgadas por convenios firmados con centros de estudios superiores o escuelas técnicas, o entregadas también por vecinos dispuestos a compartir su conocimiento con los jóvenes. Refuerzo escolar y homologación educativa. Apoyando a los beneficiarios que asisten a la escuela, en el CDA cuentan con los recursos y el apoyo para que allí realicen sus tareas escolares o repasen sus lecciones. Esto les permite mantener o mejorar su rendimiento en la escuela y entusiasmarse con el estudio, y así reducir cualquier intención de abandonar su formación escolar. La homologación, por su parte, es volver a estudiar o empezar a estudiar si nunca lo hiciste. Gestión de oportunidades. Es abrir a los jóvenes la posibilidad de accesar a becas, pasantías, habilitación laboral, acceso al empleo, entre otros. Estos beneficios son para aquellos beneficiarios de la edad laboral. El desafío de soñar mi vida. Esta es la filosofía de los centros de alcance. Este esfuerzo supone que cada joven defina sus metas y proyecte su alcance en el tiempo, contando con un mentor que lo guíe en el desarrollo de los pasos a seguir para el cumplimiento de sus sueños. Voluntariado. Los voluntarios se vuelven la columna de los CDA, ya que son ellos los que dan apoyo al coordinador y a todos los beneficiarios. Los centros de alcance por mi barrio se han convertido en una experiencia exitosa en prevención de violencia en la región. Además, los centros de alcance son una respuesta y una nueva alternativa para que los jóvenes de Centroamérica construyan un mejor futuro lejos de la violencia. Así que ya lo sabes, conoce y visita un centro de alcance por mi barrio y conviértelo en tu segunda casa.
Perfect. And thank you so much for that video. Now I would like to turn things over to our colleague, Mike McCabe. He's the agency senior youth advisor for USAID. Mike will be kind of guiding us through the introduction to this toolkit and some of the discussion with our colleagues that have joined us today. So Mike, welcome.
Thank you so much, and welcome to everybody. Good afternoon, good morning to some of you. We're really glad to have you all part of this discussion and launch of our new online toolkit for setting up youth centers, after-school programs, and safe spaces for young people. Everywhere I have the opportunity to travel around the world, young people often, the top two things they are asking and looking for, one is opportunities that get them into jobs and income, and the second one is often a safe space and a youth space in their community. And so it is, as Maria said, one of those 7 key features that we know are part of that evidence-based model of positive youth development that USAID, the US government, and now around the world, organizations have been using as their philosophy and their approach to effective youth programming. And I want to start off, first of all, with a lot of thanks both to our panelists today. We've got some of the outstanding people who have been in this movement of creating safe spaces and youth centers over decades. I also want to thank the people who pulled together this toolkit, and it's truly an example of collective impact. It is drawn from examples of youth centers and organizations on all continents that touch on different aspects of effective after-school programs and youth centers and safe spaces. I also want to thank those who helped contribute to actually design and develop the toolkit, Isaiah Senes and Katie Green and Maria Brindlemeyer, the Youth Power 2 Learning and Evaluation team, and all the partners who contributed to it, but mainly to those who every day are on the front line helping run and organize youth centers. We want to start, first of all, is asking each of you to think about a question. So if you go to the poll that is coming up here, and you should see it in, I think, Cole, yep, there it is right there. Did you participate or benefit as a young person from a youth center or safe space program? Please click in the poll right now if you participated or benefited from a youth center program. And the reason I bring that up, and Cole, if you wouldn't mind going back one slide, on the slide thing, there we go. The pictures at the opening there, one of the big takeaways that we got from developing this online toolkit was that it's not about the hardware, it's about the software. And what we mean by that is the picture on the left there is in Bor, South Sudan. And that is a youth center program off to the left that was run out of a tent in a displaced persons camp in Bor in South Sudan. And every day they ran programming as a youth center, and those people you see in the picture helped run that program. On the right is a picture of a youth center that I had the privilege of working as part of a USAID program in Panama, where we set up 22 youth centers in gang-impacted communities. And the young person there is typical of the journey of some young people, where he had unfortunately grown up in an abusive household and then ended up joining a gang and kind of traveling around between communities looking for a new sense of purpose. And when he found Pastor Manuel, who you see in that picture, he found a new opportunity to get back engaged in school, to learn a new trade, to be part of a youth against violence movement. And that helped him transform his life. And both he and Pastor Manuel talk about why having a safe space in that community as an anchor for young people to come together was transformative for giving him that second chance in his life. As we can see here, there's a lot of people who didn't have a chance to have a safe space or a youth program in their community when they were growing up, about 2/3, and about 1/3 did. Our vision and our goal is that every young person should have access to a safe space in the non-school hours. And that could take a lot of different forms, whether it's in a school-based setting like we'll hear about with Glasswing, or a community-based setting, even when it's in a conflict-impacted community like we'll hear from Harold, or in other environments that serve a broader area like we'll hear from Doug from UN Habitat. So our agenda today, we're going to quickly go through the toolkit. This is a fabulous toolkit. It draws the best open source examples of resources that you can draw upon for curriculum, for tools and sheets to help you in designing your new youth center, in managing the youth center, in scaling and sustaining your youth center. And then we'll go into some examples from around the world and then open it up for you for questions. I ask that at any time, feel free to drop your questions into the chat box, because that's going to be really key for in our Q&A part, that we take advantage of the thoughts that you have. We'll also be dropping in links to the toolkit, and we'd ask you today, share that out broadly. Encourage those who are in your network, whether they're government officials or nonprofits or other donor partners, share that toolkit out to explore that, and think about how in your community or country you could have a dialogue about how you can draw upon that. So let's jump into the toolkit now here. And so let's see. Oh, first, I'm sorry, my apologies. We're going to go into one more video that you there. Let's see. All right, there we go. All right, the slide is up. Sorry about that. So let's first jump into what is in the toolkit that you see there. So in the very opening of it, what you're going to find is you can go in and we've got a evidence section looking at what is the evidence behind it. So let me give you an example. In the 22 communities where youth centers were set up in Panama between 2010 and 2013, what we saw was a change in the level of safety in the community. Perception of safety went from 38% in these gang-impacted communities to 62%. And it was in a controlled study against other communities. So it had a dramatic impact in creating a sense of safety in those communities where that is. So in the evidence section, you'll be able to see a lot about kind of what's exactly the evidence there that can support you. And we also obviously have a lot of other information related to what impacts it has on psychological and physical safety, what it has in terms of supportive relationships, opportunities for belonging. And this all links over also to some of the M&E and learning components. The next section of it looks at the types of youth centers and what do we know about these different models. And as I said, there's a lot of different types of models we'll hear about today. Some of them take advantage of that school infrastructure, and they do it in the safe space of the school, but in the non-school hours. And the benefit of that is that you have, a space that is well set up. Sometimes teachers serve as the volunteers in those non-school hours, and it links into curricular activities at times. Then we have the other component, which are more safe spaces and empowerment programs in the community. So it could be Like we know in Africa, there's the ELA programmer Balika, which are girls' safe empowerment circles, or it could be actual centers that we've talked about. Then we get down into the implementation section of the online toolkit. And in here, this is where you could click down through. These are just a few of the resources you can find. So the Urban Youth Center Setup Guide by UN Habitat, Doug will talk a little bit more about it. This is a whole setup guide that helps you walk through it. Or at youth.gov, which is our US government platform for young people, we have an entire curriculum there for starting and operating after school programs that you can access through this. The Management and Operations of Outreach Centers Guide by Creative Associates is also in there. And you can go in, and again, it walks you through everything from thinking about where do we put a youth center in our community in partnership between youth and the municipality and maybe faith-based organizations and other CBOs that are in the community. Then how do we run it? How do we recruit volunteers? So let's go down to the next section there. Cole, if you go down one more to scale. All right, so under scale, what we've got is a whole series of different experiences about how we put together what I call the 4 legs of the table for sustaining and scaling youth center models. So part of that is what are we doing and how do we approach local government support, whether that's in kind or human resources or subsidies that will underwrite some of these. And we've got models of that. How do we mobilize volunteers and more importantly, effective management of volunteers for youth centers? How have we seen some really good models of the private sector being engaged? And because private sectors see youth centers in a key way, they see them as an opportunity for up and coming employees for their companies that may be co-located in nearby communities. And then finally, how do we develop social enterprises? So you might have seen in that video at the beginning, there was a gym that was part of a youth center. So that's actually generating income for those youth centers to help sustain some of the costs, as are some of the info cafes that are tied to them. So these are all just different examples of some of those components that are in that. Then the next section of it is, if we could go one more, Cole, on M&E. The big question is, do these work? What are we trying to achieve through this? So what we've done is we've created links to a lot of different of the best examples of how do we measure after school youth outcomes or youth center outcomes in programming. We also have the Positive Youth Development Measurement Toolkit tied in there, as well as how do we measure soft skills effectively. So all of these are open source resources that you can find as you're putting together your new youth center or trying to strengthen the components. Can you go one more there, Cole? So one of the best useful parts of this entire downloadable toolkit or the online version is you can go in and you can look at the resources for existing curricula. So there are resource sections that will walk you through the open curriculum that we've gathered from across the world on education, girls empowerment, advocacy, and civic engagement. And you can use these curriculums in your centers. Go down one more, please. It also has checklists on how you staff, checklists for common things that you would want to have in your center. So if you're putting together a budget because you want to create a center or a set of centers, you know, what do you need to know for that? Clear rules and expectations for how it's done. We also have checklists on the actual indicators that a number of them use. What we're going to do right now is I'm going to open up my screen to just show you. Let's make sure this works. Share screen. Yes. And here, let's see if this works. If it doesn't, we will go back to the other way. So if you look here, this is the actual downloadable toolkit. Cole, can you confirm that you can see that? All right. So when you go down through it, the whole toolkit is downloadable as well as searchable online. But when you get down toward the appendixes at the end, what you'll see here, and I'll try and go a little bit slower, you've got resources which are operational resources, how to identify objectives, how to do operations planning. So we've organized the toolkit. So depending on where you are in developing your youth center program, you've got the best practice tools for each of the sections of it: operational planning, how to do research studies, the objectives, how to do staff training, the resource mobilization components, and on for that section. Then down in the next section below it, we've got all the curricula broken out by education curricula, by girls empowerment curricula, leadership, vocational training, health, and designing curriculum. And then we have a whole section, thanks to many of you who submitted your best practice example of youth centers. And you can hyperlink and take a look at some of those youth centers along the way. So this gives you just a general sense of what's in this toolkit. It has been a labor of love between lots of organizations that care about making sure that every young person has a safe space. I'm gonna stop sharing right now. And what we'd like to do right now is share one more video with you. And then we're gonna go and have a conversation with some of our great experts today. So Cole, if you wouldn't mind sharing one more video telling the story of a different network of youth centers.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mike.
Esta es la escuela donde estudié toda mi vida, desde primer grado hasta bachillerato. Hoy la veo con nostalgia porque recuerdo todo lo que aprendí, cómo me ayudó a ser la persona que soy ahora. Veo estos salones y me veo a mí misma ahí recibiendo clubes que me ayudaron a ser quien soy. Mi nombre es Stephanie, tengo 21 años y soy de El Salvador. Recuerdo que fue en el año 2011 donde inició el programa de escuelas comunitarias. Fui parte del club líder, club de debate y del club de liderazgo. Después hice voluntariado como estudiante líder. El programa de escuelas comunitarias nos brinda oportunidades para que nosotros los jóvenes adquiramos nuevas habilidades y la escuela se convierte en un espacio más seguro y más comprensivo y de apoyo. Cuando fui parte de él, me abrió la mente, me enseñó a luchar por mis metas y a soñar. La primera experiencia que como estudiantes vivimos en las escuelas comunitarias son los clubes. Desde ahí empieza a cambiar todo. Vivimos talleres, capacitaciones, salidas y conocimos a personas que nos inspiran y nos motivan a ser la mejor versión de nosotros mismos. Ahora que soy ex estudiante me doy cuenta que con cada una de las experiencias estamos recibiendo algo más importante, un lugar seguro. Cada taller, club o salida recibimos apoyo, confianza e inspiración. Hoy, 5 años después, comprendo que más allá de las habilidades de canto y baile o debate que aprendí la capacidad de superar obstáculos y de ser resiliente. Otro de los aspectos más importantes que vivimos mis compañeros y yo fue contar con modelos positivos a seguir. Antes que el programa llegara a la escuela, tenía compañeros que andaban en malos pasos. Después empezamos a ir a los clubes y empezamos a verlo como nuestro lugar seguro, como nuestro segundo hogar, porque sentíamos que nos protegían, nos daban consejos y nos enseñaban a visualizar un futuro diferente, con metas profesionales y personales. Hoy puedo asegurar que el programa de escuelas comunitarias fue una de las mejores cosas que me pudo haber pasado en mi vida, no solo por todas las habilidades y personas increíbles que conocí, sino por todo el apoyo que me han dado mi comunidad. Lo mejor de todo era que me enseñaron que sí es posible lograr un futuro diferente. Esto me ha ayudado a desenvolverme en la universidad y el trabajo y creo que me servirá para toda mi vida. En la actualidad estudio 5º año de licenciatura en Contaduría Pública y trabajo en el área. Ni yo me lo creo. Antes de todo este programa, los sueños de los jóvenes acá era trabajar como meseros y las niñas de mi edad se convertían en mamás jóvenes. Hoy pensamos en ser profesionales. Sin duda agradezco a cada club, cada taller y cada salida extracurricular, pero lo que más agradezco son las pláticas, los consejos y la habilidad de estar ahí y ser ese sentido de comunidad que anhelaba.
So a great testimony of the impact that it has on lives. What we want to do right now is welcome Selena De Sola from Glasswing and Doug Reagan from UN Habitat and Harold Sibaha. And the three of them have tremendous experience in this area, but looking at the people who are also as part of the event today, I see Enrique Roig and Paul Teeple and John Seibel and lots of others who have tremendous experience in this area. So we really do want to have a discussion and have an answer to some of the questions, but we're going to start, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, asking each of our kind of three invited guests to talk a little bit about their model. So Selena, can you talk a little bit about what we've learned about Glasswing's model and how it's grown over the past few years?
Sure. So like you were explaining, Mike, thank you. First, thank you for the opportunity. I'm excited to be here with everybody, with this community of peers. For us, I think when we started 14 years ago, we realized that because kids had, the kids that were in school had 4 hours of schooling, 4.5 hours of schooling a day, either in the morning or the afternoon, we realized schools were empty. And so we were seeing that they had very little time in school, and that schools were being underutilized as community resources, but they had amazing convening power. So what we decided to do early on is leverage existing school infrastructure. You were talking about the hardware and the software. So we decided the hardware to kind of leverage that infrastructure and the convening power of schools, and then also convert those schools into centers of community. So bring together other community actors, and through these partnerships, basically implement programming, right? Like we wanted to make schools into safe spaces where kids can feel secure, where they can get together and learn with their peers, have fun, and develop life skills that are critical, particularly in the communities where we work in Latin America, where they face extreme adversity, right? So these are spaces where they could develop relationships with positive, caring adults outside their families, and also places where they can feel more hopeful and have aspirational thinking. So basically, and you can see on the slide, it has different components. We have the after school programs they're catered to the interests of kids. For us, it's really important to constantly ask students what they're interested in. And most kids participate in these programs 2 hours a week with volunteers who lead these programs. There are about 20 volunteers per school, and we have one school coordinator. We also have these community integration activities that involve what you see on the slide. All of our work at this point is trauma informed. We've been learning a lot. And I think going with what Enrique said in the chat, when kids are exposed to trauma, it's really important to think about the mental health aspects of this. So we now work in 10 different countries, and we've been able to scale directly and also scale by transferring methodology to other partners. We've worked with government. So, I think one of the main things is that partnership, making sure that we're present in communities long-term, that we're committed long-term to these relationships, that we have these cross-sector partnerships, and that we stay committed to learning and very flexible. So for us, it's also been really important to conduct constant evaluations, our own, and also external independent evaluations, to make sure that we're achieving the outcomes together with the students. And you can see the other two components, which are academic support and also the service learning, going back to the agency, assets, enabling environment, and the contribution. So I think I'll leave it at that, because I know we're going to have a longer conversation in a couple minutes.
Go to the next slide. All right, and now we're going to pass it to Doug and go over to Kenya to hear a little bit more about the model that UN Habitat has been promoting.
Thanks so much. So yeah, really great to be here. So thanks so much. So one of the models that we have, I think our first center was in 2003 in Nairobi, Kenya. Was the One-Stop Youth Resource Centers. To kind of boil it down to what makes these ones tick, I think there's three areas, let's say. Number one is that we use, very similar to positive youth development, we use what asset-based community development. We really view young people, and we really view the communities. Just a second, I'm gonna close the door. Apologies. It's getting noisy. So asset-based. So we view the community as having assets, as being assets, versus kind of a needs-based approach, which is kind of this never-ending trying to fill a hole. And this is, I think, really important when we're working with at-risk communities, highly at-risk communities, such as in informal settlements, as well as in conflict situations. I mean, the young people in the informal settlements here are vastly young. 70% of the population is under the age of 30. many of them cities are becoming younger and younger, and informal settlements even more so than that. I mean, when you're looking at young people that are making $5 a day or less, or if you're looking in conflict situations where there's always threats of violence, there's often this perception that they're all aspirational young people. There's something that we can build them as leaders of tomorrow. Whereas we don't see that. I mean, we see that young people are leaders of today, and we see it all the time, that these young people are able to do amazing things in sometimes horrific situations. So what we really look for is to build that, and that's what we build these centers around. We're not looking for perfect centers, and I really like the previous idea of, looking at schools and saying, okay, they're only in school so many hours, so we can use the schools outside that time. We also do that. We find there's often lots of spaces, oddly enough, in informal settlements and in other, that we can use and modify and renovate. And I say this to my staff all the time. I said, we do not build, we renovate. We always renovate, because especially when you're looking at issues of in cities and such, where nobody really holds title to any land or deed, that if you're starting to try to build from square up, it just can take a long time and can be extremely expensive and not really valuable. So we look at that, and we look at how we can build these centers, and we build the centers based on the capacities of the young people and the capacities of the communities. Again, the leadership style we look at is what we call youth-led development, again, a very asset-based perspective and approach. And I'd say sometimes we might go to the bit of the extreme, because we find oftentimes that young people aren't seen as assets at all to their community and such. So we really try to push this, and we really try to build on it. Then what comes out of that oftentimes we're less concerned with the services that we pre-plan into the space. So we find that there's many commonalities amongst what we plan, but most times we build around, again, where young people see the needs are. So obviously livelihoods is huge, and informal settlements at most of the time builds around waste stream. I mean, plastics, recycling, even the running of local toilets is a very big thing in the informal settlements. So we often build in livelihoods and how we can train and how we can do that. But also the other areas that we look at are technology, obviously, is very big, and young people want that ability, the aspiration to be able to use technology as a way to move on with their lives. Recreation is also big. So most of our centers have football pitches that have been actually reclaimed and recovered. And then the third area oftentimes is health. When we initially started our centers, they were VCTs, the voluntary counseling centers for HIV/AIDS. That has since moved on to more to a whole range of other things. And as of right now, of course, the pandemic is the major issue that we're dealing with. Yeah, and then just there are two more pieces. One is that what you see in the picture here is our center in Kigali, in a place called Kimisagara, which is the poorest area of Kigali. Again, they're doing training. This is tailoring, but they have a whole range of different training centers. I mean, this is really one of our best centers. And one piece I did miss, and I mentioned, and the thing is local government. All our stuff, because UN Habitat is the UN agency of cities, and the UN agency of cities and towns and local government, always our partnership is with local government. And we found that this has been a huge asset in terms of sustainability. Local government doesn't go anywhere. There's always going to be local government. Now it can be good and bad and corrupt and so on, but still it's there, and we build into local government, and they also have really great assets such as land. So they're able to provide that. So we really build into that. And the last thing, just to mention, one of the great successes we've had over the last year during this pandemic is that we were approached by many of these youth groups that we work with in the informal settlements, both in Kenya, Somalia, and strangely enough, Ecuador. And they came to us and said, listen, our communities are terrified of what's going on. And what they really perceived was they wanted to do something that they felt they could do. And they came up with the concept of hand washing stations. So starting in March, and by August, mid-August, International Youth Day, we announced it. They had done 2.5 million hand washes between 94 stations over a multiple of communities, informal settlements and such. And they also did a whole other range of COVID prevention things everywhere, from livelihoods and so on. So, and it was a runner-up for the Secretary General's Award for Innovation. And again, this was driven by them. They came to us. It wasn't us going to them. And I get what it really ended up for us is more of a proof of concept that young people are capable. The concept of youth-led can happen. And it happens in and around these centers. And the centers have become the core of this emergency response. They've been places where everything is based. And yeah, so that would be about it.
Thanks so much, Doug. We're going to switch over to Harold now, who also since 2006 has been really innovating on this model across Central America. Harold?
Thank you, Michael, and just congratulations on the toolkit launching. I think it's a great asset. And thanks for inviting. I'm a firm believer of the beauty and the virtues of youth centers. We started in 2006, started in Guatemala, just implementing a USAID crime prevention project. Had very little funding. We're looking for solutions to reduce crime in communities, working in different communities, very high-risk communities. And we were coming from an experience of establishing a youth house, a larger youth house with paid staff, coordinators, trainers, and facing the reality that that's not sustainable. And USAID projects are not going to stay there forever. So we were just challenged to think, how can we bring solutions to the communities that are going to remain beyond us? And that's what the outreach centers are. Outreach centers are sustainable, they're scalable. They provide an anchor in the communities for youth. Many of those communities that you saw in the first video, you see rural communities, and you see peaceful communities when you get there, but most of them, had gangs, gang groups in those communities, and that's the only role model that youth in those communities had. So the outreach centers offer a different way of seeing the community and trying to really deal with those risk factors that drive youth into violence. So initially we started with 3 outreach centers and basically trying to involve faith-based organizations because we saw they were actually playing a role in preventing crime in those communities. We had $16,000 for each outreach center. And we were assuming that the faith-based organizations were going to pay the salaries of the coordinators later on. Well, that wasn't the reality. They didn't have the funds. And that's why we started involving the community-based organizations and involving the local governments. As Doug said, local governments are key for that sustainability. The outreach centers, they offer a space, a safe space for youth in those communities. And as you saw in the video, you have from gyms, labs, and tutoring, which is great just for kids to come and do their homework. And that's a safe place for them. One of the key components of that outreach center is the coordinator. They're youth from the same communities. And they are taught into believing in the youth themselves. Many of these youth coming to the outreach many of those are dropouts. They don't believe in themselves. They lack identity, and that's the role of a coordinator and the role of the volunteers. Volunteers are the backbone of the centers because they are volunteers, and in the last project in El Salvador, there were like 3,500 volunteers working in outreach centers at a certain time, a certain period of time, which is great. The impact in the lives of the volunteers, as you talk to the volunteers and what the outreach centers have meant to them, and where they are right now, is also an indirect outcome of the centers. We first started in 2006 in Guatemala and expanded to El Salvador in 2008, 2009 in Honduras, and 2010 in Panama. The model has expanded up to almost 300 outreach centers in the region. And it has expanded, one, because USAID believe in the model. You know, it started under a cooperative agreement. It's moved to 5 or 6 different projects that USAID has been replicating. There's some centers that are being funded by the private sector, which is also good, 1 or 2 in El Salvador, 2 by the Embassy of Canada, but mostly USAID is the funder of the centers. Each center is $25,000. As a result, we increased the investment for the outreach centers, at least in El Salvador. And basically the operation is from $7,000 to $8,000, $9,000, you know, per year. And that's because, you know, the only paid staff is the coordinator. And basically local governments pay for that salary, pay for the rent. And as you saw, some of the houses are not great, but it doesn't matter. It's what you find in the community. The hardware is not important, as I said, you know, it's the software and the sense of protection of those youth and that you have in those communities. The role that the coordinators play, you know, we have many anecdotes of coordinators, you know, just negotiating with the gang to just rescue a kid, an 11-year-old kid from the gang. One I remember was this coordinator talking to the gang group and telling them, you know, please give me this kid. And one of the responses was, okay, you can take him to the outreach center. He has to go to church and he has to stay in the outreach center. If he goes back into crime or comes back here, you're going to be responsible. So this type of commitment that the volunteers have in each center is what makes a difference. Of course, the reduction of homicides has happened in Central America, and many of those communities, I wouldn't say it's just because of the outreach centers, definitely not, but the outreach centers have played a role in those communities. We have videos with police officers saying how the community changed when the outreach center was established in the community. And it's just because the kids were not on the streets. They had a place to go. They had people who cared for them. So basically, and now in the times of the pandemic, the outreach centers have played a very important role in terms of emergency assistance. Many of those coordinators, you know, have been moving and distributing goods in the communities, medicines, and they are leaders in the community and respected by community members. One of the centers just found out, you know, just collecting the homework in the mornings from the teachers through the outreach center's internet. So the kids do the homework, and in the afternoon they bring the homework back to the outreach center, so the coordinator will send it to the teachers just because they don't have any computers. And so basically, the outreach center is it's an anchor in that community. It's sustainable. It's scalable and makes a difference in those in people's lives in specific communities, in those specifically those affected by crime and gangs.
Thank you so much, Harold. That's great to get 3 different models and perspectives. I want to go to a fairly rapid round of questions because of the limited time we have. So I want to start with Sarah Morin's question about curious about impact and how we measure that. And what do you wish you could capture through monitoring and evaluation that's been hard to capture so far? What do you observe that you wish you could prove? Anybody want to jump on that one?
I'd
We
love
wish
to,
we could
Mike.
prove that,
I think
that people are less likely to be involved in violence or migrate.
right. Well, I love that question. I think all three of us on the panel and you, Mike, have been involved. We've done randomized control trials. We've done all kinds of studies. We're currently doing several studies, I should say, with partners who do the studies with us, because most of them are external evaluations. And I think, although we've proven many of the things, I think all of us have worked on life skills, on resiliency, on reducing aggressive behavior, reducing violence. One of the things that I just want to put out there that I think we're missing, and maybe it's because we're so focused on these RCTs and not other forms of research, but I think one of the things we're missing is kind of the intangibles of what this does from a community building standpoint. Because the research methods right now are so focused and the gold standard is this RCT, there's a lot of nuance that I think, so Sarah, that question, what do we wish we could prove? I think longitudinal studies would be amazing. Harold was talking about stories that young people, what's happened in the future. And we've looked at some of our graduates as well and what they've done. But I think we're missing something really important. And that nuance of the social fabric aspect of what these centers generate, whether they're school-based or community-based or in refugee camps, I think we're still missing that. So I love that question because I think we have a huge challenge in front of us in terms of measuring, capturing the nuance.
That's a great answer. And I know Glasswing's done some really remarkable work also on social emotional skills development and psychosocial support and the role that plays of young people having that safe space to build that sense of agency again. Doug or Harold, any quick thoughts on that one?
No,
Sure.
basically, go ahead, Doug.
You sure? Okay.
Yeah. go ahead.
Just taking off on the previous, I think the thing that fascinates me most, and I've seen it actually in the last 2 or 3 weeks, and I've commented on it, is social capital and the building of social capital and actually the choice of social capital. I've had in the last, I don't know, just came up to me in the last while that I've seen the choices where young people have decided not to do something for personal gain, but to do something for social capital, for gain to social capital. Oftentimes it has to do around marriages, deaths, whatever. And it just fascinates me the kind of, how people, the choices that are made to be, and how that builds community. Because oftentimes, from a UN perspective, oftentimes ILO comes across with a purely economic argument. If you get them jobs, all will be well, and that's good. And that is not what we've heard. We did a study in Somalia with the World Bank, specifically looking at what did the Somali young people want, really where they went. And yes, livelihoods came up, but the major thing, they wanted to be heard. Governance was it. They hated corruption. They wanted to figure out ways around it. And so that to me speaks to this kind of, again, this, what you were, Selena, you were saying, I mean, this kind of social mesh, social capital. What's this kind of, can we break ourselves out of this westernized model of finances seem to advance all into what I think is the real value to a lot of these communities and their ability to make the trade-offs that to them really matter, and I've had this discussion with one of my volunteers. I'm like, what are you doing? You're going all the way up country in the middle of a pandemic to go to a funeral. Why are you doing that? This could have impacts on this and this. And it's like, and the answer is almost the stare of, well, why are you even asking that question? Yeah. And I think that's I find that that's what holds together these communities, that there is this binding, there's this, and how do you measure that and equate it to all the other things that we're told to equate to, which oftentimes are very economic and such. So anyways.
So question for Harold, you in the 300 centers, this was a question from the morning, but I want to bring up now, given the long history of the variety of youth centers around the world, are we seeing broader social inclusion within the centers that attract vulnerable groups, whether it's LGBT or a balance between young men and young women in the centers? Are there more advanced centers able to include sensitive topics like gender-based violence prevention. What would be your take on that?
Well, many of those centers were established in a very conservative type of communities. You know, we promoted definitely gender understanding, and we invited. The center is open for everybody. There's an issue of religion too, because you have centers, you know, that are probably supported by Catholic Church or by Evangelical Church, you know, and so how can you really kind of promote that the center is for everyone? And I think we've been successful in that sense, you know. And we don't have any LGBT programs per se in the centers, you know, has been informed, has been talked to, but I'm not sure right now how many LGBT members we have in those centers.
Between young men and young women, out of curiosity?
It's almost 50-50. We had we were counting how many youth in each center, women and men. It's almost 50-50, you know. So it's despite that the males are the ones more affected by violence, more, you know, in terms of joining gangs and in terms of being the victims of crimes, you know. So many of the initiatives, you know, you want to give those males more better opportunities to reduce their involvement in gangs, you know, but it's 50-50, you know, everyone is involved. And talking, you know, in terms of, we still have to measure a lot of the impact of these centers, but how can you measure a reduction of recruitment from a gang? You know, it's just we have a perception, you know, we just measure perception in terms of a reduction in crimes and murders, robberies, safety in the communities, houses that were empty. Right now, people are returning, these kind of things. But I really want how many members, how many of those youth in an outreach center would have been in a gang. We don't know that because they're in the center. So those kind of, that type of impact, you know, is just hard to measure. But I just want to finish here, you know, it's just when you're implementing projects like this, you know, you have your personnel and you're limited by 8 hours a week and probably more. And there's no way you could be in many of those communities, in many of those municipalities full-time. But the centers and the coordinators and the municipalities and the community-based organizations and the faith-based organizations, you know, they are full-time. So in a way, they become an extended arms of a crime prevention project, and they're mitigating crime and providing counseling. You know, there's no value in that, and we can't measure that. You know, it's just.
So a question for all three of you, and drawing from a question from Paul Teeple, about what have been the aha moments when you know that older leaders are trusting youth and including them more in the center's decision-making. Want to talk about this issue of how are your models really engaging young people to be partners in these centers and really bringing an authentic voice and, you know, avoiding the trap of just kind of running a center for youth rather than running a center with youth?
Mike, I think one, and I'll say just quickly, I think we've been trying more and more to just involve participants in giving us feedback. We've even had instances where we've had them interview staff we're considering hiring, because if they don't have rapport with young people, and it's not going to work. And then recently, I'll tell really quickly, we had this whole list of character strengths that we were going to use based on the evidence, right? The evidence. And then when we asked a group of students what character strengths they would pick, and we had all the right ones that ticked all the boxes, we had left one out that they picked as one of their top character strengths, and that was hope. So I think, you know, I think when we list all these things that we want to do and we want to achieve, just goes back to making sure we keep asking and making sure that we do that regularly, not just once, but that we're doing that regularly. And I think at least in our case, we can always do more, but we really strive to make sure that we're being student-centered and really client-centered in the way we're doing work.
Yeah. Other thoughts?
I mean, I think We're always
Go
going
ahead,
the same
Doug.
time. You go this time then. You go this time.
No, I was going to bring the issue of in terms of the benefits of the centers. You know, even the issue of migration. You know, is why kids leave the country. You know, is lack of opportunities and lack of basically economic opportunities, but also, you know, believing that they can make a difference and they can make a change in their own countries, and they have to migrate. You know, and in that sense, you know, some of the centers have been. They have great stories too about kids that wanted to leave and they're not leaving. You know, I don't think it's the solution, but in terms of contributions to the larger needs of youth in those communities, you know, and basically it depends on the strength of the coordinator. We actually believe in coordinators from the same communities. They are young. They don't have to have. They don't have to be a psychologist. They don't have to be a social promoter. You know, they probably could have even, you know, just having attended any college studies, but they are brilliant and they are committed. They're leaders and they believe in the other youth, and that's enough for the success of a center.
Yeah. We're coming close up on the. Go ahead, Doug.
Just in terms of leadership, it is challenging. What we try to do as well is to kind of get layered leadership in terms of giving young people a chance to test out their leadership. So whether it's child to child, youth to child, young person to younger, older, you know, like trying to at least have people kind of come up through that way so that we can, I mean, we really like to see people coming up through the ranks versus hiring outside or hiring for specific skill sets. And a lot of times because we're dealing with, we're dealing with young people that don't have the skill sets. I think that we work on that. And the second thing I just wanted to mention was the issue of gender. It was quite fascinating we did when we set up the youth center in Mogadishu, because it was in a Muslim community, and we said mixed, and then from the leaders of the communities they said split, men, women, two centers basically. And then we sat down with the youth and they said, no, we don't want that. We think we can make this happen. And it was the young people that we worked with to kind of convince that there could be ways of having blended programming, even though there had to be separate spaces, which I still believe anyways in any structured center, that you have to create safe spaces for women. I mean, yes, women may not be going into gangs, but they face a whole other level of violence that you don't see. And the whole other level of stigmatization that you don't see. You need to create safe spaces for them within centers, because at least in the informal settlements and such, we found a lot in the region here, is that it's often men that come out. It's the men that have the mobility, the men that end up overwhelming your center. So you need to create that space to make it happen. Anyways.
Awesome. So I'm going to give you each 30 seconds for a closing question here. Some people would say, oh, you know, youth centers, their heyday was the 80s in this country or region, or in the 90s in Central America, or in the 2010s, you know. What is the one thing? We've got this great new toolkit, but it's just a toolkit. You know, what is the biggest thing that we as a donor community, as an implementing partner community, in partnership with networks of young leaders in these communities, what's the one thing that really we should be focusing on in the year ahead if we really want to increase the quality and the scale and sustainability of safe spaces, after school programs, and youth centers? Harold.
Yes, you know, one of the you would love to have, you know, outreach centers, you know, what they have with the state-of-the-art equipment or the best training tools and the best trainers. But, you know, I had to keep that up in our thinking and our design, just to make the centers sustainable. So, you know, it's just, as we say, the outreach centers are not vocational centers. They provide the training and based on the expertises of the volunteers, and some they even, just get Japanese in one center because one of the volunteers is a Japanese speaker and they're training youth in Japanese. But that I wouldn't trade that, even, if it is the most sophisticated center in terms of training and equipment, I wouldn't trade that for the sustainability. That model that can be replicated, low cost, that the cost should be distributed among different local governments. I think that is something that makes a difference.
Great, Selena.
I would say just remember that this takes time. It takes time to engender ownership and to get these things going. Harold's, mentioning sustainability. And then also really like thinking about how we can partner with public sector too, whether it's municipalities or ministries of education in case of our school-based models. But I think partnerships are really important to be able to scale this and reach more young people and children.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Doug.
Yeah, I mean, for us, partnership with local government, listening to the community and what the community needs. I mean, I guess the number of, I've seen the number of failed youth centers and the continue try to make them happen, yet they keep coming back. I mean, it's not like people just say, oh, well, youth centers failed, so we'll never do them again. There's government policies and policies to renew them and so on and so on. And that's what suggests to me is that there's a missing pieces. And I think this toolkit could be one amazing piece towards actually providing the tools for government or whoever's, or youth or community, whoever's trying to build these centers out, because it's definitely something we've looked at as well, is that the desire is there, demand is there. It's just that they oftentimes they're built wrong. They're just not built in a way that are sustainable.
Thank you three so much for your insights, your commitment to it. Thanks for everybody who was on. We are capturing all the questions, and we will try and find a way to send a response back to you if you've submitted a question. Our ask of you, please download the toolkit or get the hyperlink, share it out through your social media, share it out through your networks. If you go to Youth League Global on Instagram or Twitter or on Facebook, you could also find a link to it all. Blast it out through your networks. We look forward to how all of our agencies work together to make that opportunity that every young person should have access to a quality, safe space program in their community. And thanks again. Take care.